Welcome to the second day of the Clean Fuel Summit, our virtual conference for 2022. This is Wednesday morning and you are at the Funding Your Projects seminar. So here we get going. First, I'm going to introduce you and pass it off to Tyler Herman, the Louisiana Clean Fuels Project Manager. Here you go.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you all for coming to our second day of the summit. I want to give a quick thank you first to our corporate sponsors, Entergy and AmeriGas, who are also both dues-paying members of Louisiana Clean Fuels. So we really appreciate all the support. And then our supporting sponsor for this summit is FuelsFix. Fuelsfix.com is a great online publication that we occasionally write articles for that deals with all alternative fuels and all clean cities type stuff. Is run by Clean Cities Coalitions, and it is a wonderful resource for all things alternative fuels. Next slide, please. So yeah, today is day 2 of the Clean Fuel Summit, and we have this great presentation with myself and Callie Stanek of G&A. Going to talk a little bit about funding clean fuels projects, some grant programs that are out there, some best practices for all of that. And we'll just go ahead and get kicked off. So next slide. So we have us three, as I mentioned, Tyler Herman, Project Manager for Louisiana Clean Fuels, Callie Stanek is Program Manager with Gladstein, Andros and Associates. Y'all may know of, well, they're kind of all over the place in the alternative fuel world, running the ACT Expo, doing a bunch of grant stuff, and she'll talk a little bit about what they do. And then Ann Veller, Executive Director, who you heard at the beginning of all of this. And we talk a little bit about clean cities. So Louisiana Clean Fuels is a clean cities coalition. We are one of 2 here in Louisiana. And Clean Cities is a national network of coalitions under a Department of Energy program. And we basically have the primary goals of building partnerships to advance affordable domestic transportation fuels and technologies, really a lot of alternative fuel vehicle stuff, infrastructure, as well as any idle reduction, vehicle mileage travels reductions, those sorts of things to increase efficiency and reduce fuel usage across the country. And the reason that we're a big network of coalitions is so that we're really on the ground in our local support for these projects, as opposed to being, somebody based in Louisiana who works on projects in Ohio and has no idea about what they're doing over there. It's nice to have that local support because we know the landscape, we know how things work here. Next slide. And we fit under the Vehicle Technologies Office at Department of Energy, under the technology integration standpoint. So there are 5 different pillars of the VTO, the Vehicle Technologies Office, won't really go into, but we're under the technology integration part, where we're really trying to get these vehicles that are being manufactured and being kind of researched and actually get them on the road and get them in real customers' hands, real consumers' hands. And we think that that's very important. We have the 4 primary goals listed at the bottom there: improve energy efficiency of our entire transportation network across the country, increase domestic energy security by moving towards domestic, locally produced fuels, and in reducing operating costs for consumers and businesses. All this comes with a cost, and we're trying to bring that cost down as low as possible. And then increase the global competitiveness of the US economy, again, by switching to domestic fuels, domestic manufacturing, and all those sorts of technologies. Go on. We have a pretty broad portfolio in clean cities. We work kind of in every space, light, medium, heavy duty vehicles all across the board, alternative and renewable fuels and infrastructure, from natural gas to propane to electrification to hydrogen vehicles. We work with it all. Idle reduction measures and fuel economy improvements. Those are kind of the softer technologies that are easy for everybody to implement. Sometimes simply turning the engine off is the best thing that you can do for saving money and saving emissions. And then all the new mobility stuff coming along the line, like rideshare, which is kind of becoming more and more popular these days, autonomous vehicles, traffic light synchronization, all those kind of cool things that are a little bit outside of the fuel realm, but are still relevant for reducing costs and reducing fuel usage. And then I mentioned we're a national network of coalitions. There are about a little over 75 active coalitions across the country. Our territories contain over 80% of the US population. So wherever you are, you're almost certainly in one of our coalitions territories. And then we're not territorial at all. We work with each other very, very closely. This summit is in partnership with the Southeast Louisiana Clean Fuel Partnership as well, down in New Orleans, the other Clean Cities Coalition in Louisiana. And if you're outside of the territory altogether, we're happy to help out and do anything that we can. We want this stuff to be on the road and want to do it right, and are okay with working outside of our territories. And then we're doing all this work really to build the relationships on the ground and strengthen the entire marketplace in the US, connecting fleets with the fuel providers, kind of working that networking side of things, make sure people are in the right hands and know how to best implement their projects. We offer training and information such as this webinar series today and yesterday, but also first responder training to make sure that these vehicles are getting on the road safely as possible, and that our firefighters and first responders know how to respond to incidents. Any sort of deep technical assistance, identifying funding, which is what we're doing today, what we're going to be talking about a lot in the rest of this webinar, public recognition, and then collecting data and tracking progress to make sure that we kind of understand where things are going and where things have been. And with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Callie Stanek, Program Manager for Gladstein Andrus & Associates, who's gonna talk about what they do and about a bunch of funding projects or funding programs that you can look forward to in the future. Callie?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tyler. I appreciate it. And as Tyler mentioned, my name is Callie Stanek. I'm a program manager here at GNA, Gladstein Andrus & Associates, but a lot of people know us just by GNA. We focus on incentives needed for project development in this clean transportation space. So today, the goal for my slides is really in two parts. So the first part is I just want to kind of give a high level overview of the landscape that we're seeing in the alternative fuel clean transportation space as it relates to available funding, especially with a focus on the Southeast region. And then the second part is I want to talk through kind of the approach, right sizing, figuring out how to match projects with funds and what is actually needed to secure those funds. So basically taking all of these potential grant funding opportunities and how can we turn them into recognizable revenue for all of the fleets and infrastructure providers out there. Next slide. Awesome, one more. Perfect. So GNA, in case you don't know us, we are a clean transportation and energy consulting firm. We lead market development for advanced transportation technologies, low carbon fuels and energy. Next year, we turn 30 in 2023. We're based in Southern California, but we have staff throughout the country. And we have three core teams. So we have a creative team, a technical team, and then the programs team, which is what I'm on. And we focus on all things strategy, market development, funding. So we'll go to the next slide. Awesome. So yeah, like I touched on, three core teams, but we focus on all of the consulting services on this slide. So as Tyler mentioned, we do host the annual ACT or ACT Expo, which happened this year in May in Long Beach. Great to see a lot of movement in the market there. And we focus a lot on tracking, helping to apply for and reporting on funding and incentives. We have a 90% success rate with our applications for funding. And we have submitted funding for over $1 billion worth of funding for our clients. So our focus is always getting out ahead, making sure that we're only going after opportunities that we can win and setting up projects for success. So hopefully I'll be able to share a little bit of that kind of knowledge and experience today. And kind of share the love in the funding space. So go on to the next slide. Awesome. And before we hop into the funding piece, this is just a resource that I always like to share. It goes hand in hand with a lot of the questions that we get with about funding. And this is just for the overall market in terms of all alternative fuel types, questions about what technologies are available, what trends we're seeing. This is the State of Sustainable Fleets report. It was just refreshed in the past few months. It's totally free to download. You just go to that web link on the page, stateofsustainablefleets.com. And we talk about just the key market trends in the advanced transportation space, lessons learned from some of the biggest fleets that are on the cutting edge. It covers all fuel types, so CNG, RNG, propane, electric, hydrogen, you name it. And it can just be a really good resource to fleets who are maybe just entering this space. You can go on to the next slide. I won't get too into the weeds here in some of the key findings, but these are just some of the overall market trends we're seeing. They're in the report in detail. The goal is to help kind of mitigate risk. So helping to line up fleets with the best solution for your particular fleet. You can do that with funding, but you also need to be able to do that with the technology itself and the fuel types you're choosing. So looking where there's the most TCO for different types of fleets, any mandates or policies, how they're driving the market, it's all in the report. So I'd encourage you to take a look if you haven't already. Awesome. And yeah, this is just another example of some of the information in the report as it relates to battery electric vehicles. So we can see some of the things that top fleets and early adopters are saying as far as where these alternative fuels excel and where we face the biggest hurdles. All right, so we will get right into the incentives landscape. So you can proceed to the next slide. Awesome. So I'm going to start with the broadest look, and then we'll zone in a little bit more regionally. Now, nationally, we're seeing a very competitive funding landscape. We have a team of folks who track funding across the US and Canada, over, is it 300 or 500 different funding programs related to clean vehicles, infrastructure, renewable fuel production, anything related to clean transportation. And we are seeing between $3 and $5 billion annually from a combination of sources. So this includes carbon credits, utility programs, our typical federal, state, and local government programs, some of the funding from the VW settlement, which has been available for the past few years. And in this year and probably the next couple of years, we may see a slightly higher trend in the overall amount of available funds driven by funding in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. In the past few years, like I said, we've seen a lot of federal, state, and VW settlement funds kind of driving the market. Now we're seeing a big influx of federal funding for all fuel types, as well as a heavier focus on utility players in the market and available funding through utilities. Next slide. Awesome. So getting into the federal funding. Now, there are a lot of new programs and funding for existing programs coming through this bipartisan infrastructure law. We'll touch on a few of them today. I'm going to keep it at a really high 30,000 foot view, and I'm also going to let Tyler dig in on a little bit more of the NEVI program, which is part of this funding. Louisiana Clean Fuels is helping the state come up with their plan there. So I'll let him cover that, but broadly, high level, there is a lot of funding across multiple fuel types. So a lot of the big buckets we're seeing are transit, school bus, ports, infrastructure, research and development, and overall kind of state planning. So the big buckets. There's still a lot of details to be fleshed out about these programs. So I would just stay tuned, keep an eye on them. Some of them, like I said, are running through existing programs, and some of them are going to be newer, and we're not sure, just like with the NEVI program, exactly what those funding programs will look like. And the key caveat here I want to mention is this is a huge bill with a huge amount of total funding available. there are also going to be a lot of specifics about how the funding is going to be used. So we see a lot of names on the screen right now. Not all of them are going to be available for our first choice of what maybe we want them to be available for, as for example, of private fleet. So there's going to be a heavy focus on publicly accessible infrastructure, funding for vehicles that serve public fleets and the community at large. So it will really be a question of how we can help integrate and align and dovetail some of that public funding focus with some of the private infrastructure and private vehicle fleet needs that we are also seeing in the market. Okay, next slide, perfect. Okay, so NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. This is just one of the funding programs that is flowing out of this bipartisan infrastructure law. Again, happy to talk more about this in detail and happy to let Tyler cover the bulk of it, but in summary, it's going to be $5 billion over 5 years. So to give that a perspective, the VW settlement funds, which were a huge deal and continue to fund a lot of projects, were under $3 billion total. So just NEVI alone is an enormous pot of funding that will be available as soon as later this fall. So we're currently similar also to VW. This NEVI program is a program where the states are in charge of establishing their own ways that they will be spending their allocation of NEVI formula funds. So that is the phase that we're currently in. Like I mentioned before, Louisiana Clean Fuels is helping to develop that plan for the state. Once the plans are submitted, which is going to be by August, they will be approved in September, and then funds will be available for states to use. So there's going to be over 50 competitive grants across the nation just through this program alone. It is going to focus on transportation corridor funding and charging corridor funding. So heavy focus on public access, like I mentioned, encouraging the general public to use stations more. There is an interesting caveat with this program where the definition of public access is actually if multiple, or if it's 2 or more private fleets use infrastructure that is considered public infrastructure. So there's some ability for teaming or cross-fleet use of infrastructure that might align with this program. Again, this is a great time to be engaging with your state agencies now, because these programs are in development now. And it, we'll have to see how exactly the states choose to utilize their funds. Okay, so that's the federal funding landscape right now. NEVI, now I do want to mention, of course, all that bipartisan infrastructure funding is in addition to the existing funding that's available through the EPA, the clean diesel programs, both at the national and state level, and EPA targeted airshed programs, other DOE programs. So none of that is going away. This is just in addition to. So that's the last piece for the federal part. So for Southeast regional Louisiana opportunities, where are we seeing opportunities in the trends right now? So starting off, I would say inland ports and intermodal facilities. So these are a key opportunity for expansion of electrification with shore power or the transition to alternative fuels. There is momentum growing in the shipping sector toward decarbonization and reducing marine freight emissions, and these sectors are definitely ripe for transition. So freight and goods movement companies are continuing to establish more aggressive sustainability goals. They're forcing carriers to adopt new technologies and strategies. We've already seen this in on-road transportation. It's now proliferating to rail, to marine and non-road equipment markets. And this is also really driven by companies addressing scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So going beyond just their own scope 1 emissions, they're looking at their entire supply chains and realizing that in order to meet both nationwide and corporate sustainability goals, they need to address their full scope of emissions. The next one would be the port and freight sector. So the freight industry has been really a key adopter, key early adopter of clean transportation technologies, both inside and out of the Southeast region. The question next, especially with all of this federal funding coming with an increase in regulations and policies, what are the, finding the key steps in how our states can support this expansion, and how some of those, like I was mentioning before, public charging or vehicle needs kind of can dovetail and help support the freight sector as well. Infrastructure, that goes hand in hand, right? You can't have the vehicles or the equipment without the infrastructure and the fueling to go with them. So NEVI presents room for growth around the regional corridors, and we're going to be seeing more how those public access corridors align with private, along with infrastructure. Like I mentioned before, utilities are going to be a key player in this space. And the last piece is going to be the regulations and policies. So there are a ton of different regulations nationwide. It's a really complex space right now. And so without getting too much into the weeds, we have states that are following CARB's leads by signing on to memorandums of understanding or MOUs for adopting clean transportation. We have the Advanced Clean Fleet and Advanced Clean Transportation regulations coming in California. We have Low NOx Omnibus by American, a lot of different things that are interplaying and driving the market towards a cleaner energy future, definitely with potentially some growing pains along the way. So that is kind of the key drivers, I would say, and key opportunities for funding growth in the region. Okay, next slide. Awesome. Last piece for the funding puzzle, the overall funding puzzle, is this utility piece. So utilities have really transitioned from and evolved from a role of maybe more of a sideline player to really an absolutely necessary partner in deploying alternative fuel technologies. So infrastructure is one of the biggest hurdles that we're seeing, charging and fueling infrastructure. So this is where utilities on the battery electric side are going to be coming into play. It's just, I can't stress enough how important it is to engage with them. I mean, we have, Entergy in Louisiana has a case-by-case funding program themselves for not just electric vehicle infrastructure, but also for equipment and vehicles themselves. So we're seeing them devote funding, not just, like I said, to the chargers, but also to the equipment that's going to be using them. We're also seeing a lot of commitments for make-ready infrastructure. So, separate from the actual chargers themselves, what transmission or what behind the meter transformers, trenching, et cetera, other upgrades need to happen. Utilities can step in and help contribute to projects and to get them off the ground. So really just can't emphasize enough how important the utilities are as we move forward. Okay, next slide. Awesome. So that's a little bit of a summary of the opportunities we see right now. And like I said, I'm sure Tyler will touch on some of the especially Louisiana specific funding. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we take that information. We know that there are a lot of federal programs, state and local programs coming down the pipeline. How do we take advantage of them and get successful projects across the finish line? And so that is where this next piece comes into play. So next slide. And I just want to talk about some of the lessons we've learned in applying for funding, how this process works, and some of the key things to keep in mind. So this slide, I think, is a good summary of just overall how we should be approaching funding for successful projects. So the first thing I want to talk about is just engaging early and often. I mentioned that on the last slide with utilities. It's equally important for Queen Cities, coalitions, local government, community stakeholders to make sure that you know what the goals of different agencies are. You can align your projects and make sure you're finding the best match possible for your project and what you want to do in terms of funding. And you just, funding agencies are really looking for projects that are fleshed out and have a high chance of success, right? They always want to mitigate risk. So one way we can do that is by showing that we have well-developed projects, well-developed project teams, we're engaged in the community. We know what it's going to take from an infrastructure perspective, from a permitting perspective. I can't tell you the number of times that grant applications get held up just from, having the correct fire safety building permit. So even just basic stuff like that, engaging early and often is really going to set your project up for success. And going with that, we always suggest building out your proposed project first, and then finding the funds. So if you are kind of trying to shoehorn I don't know, propane project into a really CNG focused funding program, it's not going to be successful. It's kind of missed the point. We need to make sure, and that's not getting where you need to be to as a project developer. So we always encourage you to build out the project first, then you can match up the funds. That also makes your project more likely to be chosen and more competitive for funding, because the agencies can see when something is well developed, when you have expertise in the area, and when it really addresses and is a match for what they're looking for. That also goes in hand with matching the project with the ideal funding type that you're looking for. So in the funding world, we have standard grants, we have more voucher style programs, we have tax incentives, and more partnership oriented programs. So there are programs that are really just driven towards getting older vehicles off the road and replacing them with new vehicles. It's just a strict vehicle replacement program. We also have programs that are much broader and are looking at more of a holistic or comprehensive change to maybe a freight facility and looking at the infrastructure and vehicle and community impact aspects of the project. So that's a much broader scope. All of these ranges of funding programs exist. It's a matter of finding the ones that will be a match for what you're looking for. Next up is understanding eligibility. So important. So understanding the who, what, where, and when of what a funding program is looking for. So who, some projects are specifically for public entities, school districts, transit organizations, metropolitan planning organizations. Some are for private organizations, some allow private organizations, but you must partner with a public organization. So really depends, and this is just digging into the details early so that we know what the expectations are. What, like I mentioned before, is this strictly a vehicle replacement program? Is it a program that's looking at a more comprehensive change for an overall facility, where there are definitely gates that funding agencies will put onto where vehicles can operate for particular funding programs, or how long those vehicles need to be on the road for in order to be considered for funding. And then when, understanding not just timeline for submitting an application, but also the timeline for when the new equipment or vehicles need to be on the road, when like I said, how long the project needs to operate for, when reimbursement will happen. These are all things that if we think about them early on, no problem. If we get caught up in them later, or we didn't realize some of the details later on, we try not to expend effort where we're not going to be successful. So really the who, what, where, when, very important. And then lastly, we need to appeal or write to the funding agency. Now, this is just a little bit about knowing your audience. A lot of times funding agencies, when they put together a grant program, will pretty clearly enumerate the goals that they're hoping to achieve with the program, what they're looking to accomplish, and the scoring criteria, in a very detailed fashion of how projects will be judged and selected. And it's extremely important to write to those, if there's not a narrative portion, to address those and to really frame the project from the perspective of the agency. So it might not be the way you frame a project when you're talking to another organization in your space or a potential customer. You really need to speak to the end goals that the agency is looking for when they're putting their money into investing their money into clean transportation projects. Next slide. Awesome. So yeah, this is just a little bit more in depth about some of the key parts for the grant application process. So building out our project team, like you mentioned, so many players now. Projects don't exist in a vacuum. So it's not just a fleet going after funding. We're looking at the funding agencies themselves, utilities, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, engineering, procurement, and construction providers, fueling providers. The more integrated a project is, the better chance it has at succeeding. I do want to just add on, I thought about it earlier when I was talking about it. The permitting agency is so important. So include those in your potential project teams as well. Next up. Okay. So approaching grant application, these are some of the common components that will need to be prepared in order to put together a successful application. So the goal is to always address them to the best of your ability. These things can include things like just a narrative, a project description, again, really speaking to the goals that an agency is setting forth. Having existing vehicles or equipment to scrap. So key consideration here, a lot of funding programs, the vast majority, are going to require some kind of scrappage or retirement of an older piece of equipment in order to provide fundings for the new equipment. There are sometimes model year requirements or usage requirements that qualify that old vehicle for scrappage. So making sure that you have existing units that meet those criteria and that you're willing to retire is going to be a key component in determining if you're eligible. Emissions reductions calculation, different programs have different ways of looking at this, but essentially the end goal is looking at cost effectiveness, right? So the funding agencies are looking for the best bang for their buck. How many dollars is it going to cost them to reduce X tons of emissions, whether that's criteria pollutants or greenhouse gases? Some of them are simple online calculators. They usually tend to be straightforward. That's a key component and sometimes determines how much funding you can get, right? More emissions or better cost effectiveness is going to boost your project competitiveness. Administrative forms, things like vehicle registrations, insurance, maybe not the most exciting, but very important for providing for an application. Cost share commitments and partnership letters, that goes back to the teaming that I was talking about and just building those relationships. And then any supporting documentation. This can run the gamut of different things. The thing I want to stress here is just that every grant application is different. They're all going to have slightly different timelines and requirements. And it's well worth it to put in the effort upfront to find the project that fits your needs in order to not expend unnecessary effort. And then I think we have one more slide. Right, and this is just writing your application to your audience. So this is speaking to some of the selection criteria for grant applications that I was talking about. Cost effectiveness, project sustainability, community engagement. Is the project location in a disadvantaged community or maybe an EPA ozone non-attainment region? Is your budget and efficient use of funds? Are your project partners capable and experienced in deploying similar technology projects? So these are all things that the agency is going to be interested in, and all things that any applicant should be prepared to kind of write to or address in their application materials. Awesome. Great. Well, I think that wraps up my slides. I'm going to, of course, stick on here and answer any questions. Tyler will give a little bit more of the regional funding update, but thanks very much for having me today. And Tyler, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Callie. That was a great overview, and especially like the slide on how many different things there are with the infrastructure bill and how many different programs there are. That's it's a huge kind of windfall for the industry, and I think it speaks to a lot of stuff that we're going to be speaking about today. So next slide, please, Anne. One thing I want to highlight at the beginning of this before I jump into some of the stuff I want to discuss is the AFDC, the Alternative Fuel Data Center. If y'all have heard me speak before at any point, then you know that I love this website. It has a lot of incredible information that stays very up to date with all the different programs that are around, laws and incentives, and grant programs such as everything that came out of the infrastructure law. And it's just got a bunch of wonderful information about alternative fuel vehicles, fuel economy, all that sort of stuff. So this is always my first line of attack in any sort of research that I want to do for the industry. So always want to point that out. Next slide. So I'm mostly going to talk about the NEVI program, the Clean School Bus program, but there are lots of things under the infrastructure law, like Callie pointed out. The kind of main high-level funds that we're thinking about a lot and we're kind of working on specifically are the $7.5 billion for alternative fuel infrastructure. This is separated into two pots: the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, $5 billion, which I'll talk more about in future slides. Then $2.5 billion for the community fueling portion of this. We don't know what that's going to shake out to look like in the future and what what those programs are going to look like, but that'll be a nationwide competitive grant program, again, with the funds split further into two pots, half of it for electric vehicle charging infrastructure and the other half for general alternative fuel infrastructure, which can fund propane, CNG, as well as electric vehicle infrastructure, hydrogen, that sort of stuff. That is separated quite broadly. Again, we don't have much information about that, but we'll be keeping everybody up to date as that comes out. I think we're looking at fall or so for more information on that particular set of funds. So keep your eyes peeled as the year's blazing by. And then $5 billion for the EPA Clean School Bus Program. This is a huge amount of funding. $2.5 billion for zero emission buses, which includes hydrogen and electric vehicle or electric buses. And then $2.5 billion for what they're calling clean school buses, which includes really any alternative fuel. So propane, CNG, electric, and hydrogen. Those are all separated out. And I'll talk more about the breakdown of that program later on. And then there was a $1.5 billion for the FTA low-no emission program that had a focus on electrification as well. And then more. You saw Callie's slide earlier. There are tons of programs under this particular law. And one thing I want to point out just while we have this slide up is this is really a great point for stressing how important it is to have grant programs or ideas in your heads and kind of worked out before anything comes along, because this was kind of sudden for the industry. This basically overnight, we got billions of dollars influx into the alternative fuel infrastructure or alternative fuel vehicle industry. And it's very, very, very rapid. So if you weren't prepared for it before, there's a lot of catch up to be doing. And that's just kind of a reason to really be ahead of the game. And we'll talk more about kind of tips and tricks later on, especially in the Q&A. But just one thing to really be thinking about is if funding came along, what would you want to do? And how would you want to design a project, to all of Callie's points earlier, that meets the needs of a particular grant program that comes along and achieves your goals in the most effective way possible? Because these are tax dollars. We want to use them as efficiently as we possibly can as kind of our civic duty, right? Next slide. So specifically about the National Electric Vehicle Formula Program, we're going to talk more about NEVI in a second, specifically for Louisiana, but it is $5 billion for electric vehicle corridors, which is a ton of funding. It's $1 billion per year over the next 5 years are becoming available. And that is about $10 million for Louisiana the first year, and then it's ramping up to the total of $73.4 million in Louisiana over the course of the 5 years. And I will say, as somebody who worked on the Volkswagen program quite a lot here in Louisiana with Louisiana Clean Fuels, that was only $18.6 million. That is like a fifth of the amount of the NEVI program on its own. And I probably lost 15 years of my life working on Volkswagen. So like, I'm kind of terrified at the moment, but NEVI is looking really, really good for the industry. And we'll be working quite a bit on that and discuss a little bit more. As Callie mentioned, this is distributed through the state's Department of Transportation's, this particular $5 billion set of funding. So Louisiana is definitely getting that amount of money. And then the other $2.5 billion below is going to be the competitive grants across the country. And again, we'll learn more about that later in the year. Oh, and then also while I have this up, the IIJA is the Infrastructure and Investing Infrastructure and Jobs Act or something like that. You'll hear it called that. You'll hear it called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, BIL, or just the Infrastructure Bill, which is my preferred thing because it's a little bit clearer. Next slide, please. So the NEVI program is great, $73.4 million for Louisiana. There is a link on the slide there, and these slides will be sent out later on, that will have all the funding by state listed there, so that you can read that very clearly and see how it's going to be apportioned over the 5-year program. The funding is going to be distributed in roughly equal portions over the 5 years, although the first year is a little bit smaller amount of funding than the later ones, partially because there was funding set aside for administrative purposes in the program, but also so that I can kind of ramp up as it goes along and as we learn more about it, the states develop their state plans. The funds are going to require a 20% match of non-federal dollars. So any project, whatever the project total cost is, say it's $1 million, $200,000 is going to have to come from private or state funds that are not federally derived funds. That is a federal requirement. It's actually much lower percent match that's required than most federal programs. So this is really, really good for the industry. Oftentimes it's 50% match that's required. So this is really attractive. And then there's a point there that this funding can only be used for corridor development for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We'll talk more about corridors in a second and dig into that. But this means that they're kind of limited in exactly what they can do, but the goal is to develop a national network of charging along the interstates to facilitate interstate travel, long distance travel with electric vehicles. And then it can be used for the installation, equipment cost, and operations and maintenance costs for up to 5 years. We'll talk more about the state plan and what Louisiana looks like it might be doing with that, or is planning on doing with that. But that does mean that it can kind of cover everything, which is, again, very attractive for this sort of program. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that this can only be used for corridor development. And corridors is a whole thing. So the Alternative Fuel Corridor Program is a Federal Highway Administration FHWA program that has existed for several years now. And it basically allows you to designate stretches of interstate and some highways across the country as being alternative fuel corridors, designated corridors for a given fuel type. Here in Louisiana, we already have all of our major interstates designated as being CNG and propane corridors. We had basically no corridors designated for electrification for electric vehicles, except those little stretches that you can see of I-10 and I-12 across the bottom of Louisiana. So in advance of that, we did nominate, next slide, please, the rest of the interstate system in Louisiana as being electric vehicle, planned electric vehicle corridors, so that we can unlock this funding to be spent on charging across our state in its entirety. And then you can also see, if you're familiar with the Louisiana roadways, that we do have a couple of state highways nominated, namely the Highway 90 stretch between Lafayette and New Orleans, as well as the stretches of Highway 1 and 3235 going down towards towards Grand Isle and that stretch. Reasons we nominated the highways there is the Highway 90 is going to be an extension of Interstate 49 going from Lafayette to New Orleans in the future. So that's kind of getting in advance of it becoming an interstate in Louisiana, but also because those stretches of highway are very important evacuation routes for our state. And we get hurricanes quite often here. So having those evacuation routes nominated and getting fueling along it is really, really important for the resiliency piece and kind of disaster relief piece. And you'll hear more about resiliency in the next presentation we have for the day later on, which I'll have a slide about at the end. So very, very important that we support those communities as well with this funding. Next slide. So the corridor requirements, the fact that you can only use this NEVI funding for corridor development means that you have to meet the alternative fuel corridor requirements for a given site. And those requirements are pretty stringent at the moment. You have to have the sites within 50 miles of each other as you drive, no more than 1 mile from the interstate exits. And then the stations must include, and this is kind of the big one, 4 plugs with the CCS standard, which is the SAE standard, capable of charging at 150 kilowatts simultaneously. So this is 600 kilowatts of site power, which is a lot. That is a lot of power. And this is roughly enough power to provide about 150 miles of range in 20 minutes. That's very, very dependent upon the vehicle and all sorts of factors, but that's just very, very rough rule of thumb for those unfamiliar. And in such a site, it costs upwards of $750,000, depending on, again, lots and lots of factors. But we're looking at pretty high costs there. This means that we can probably fund somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 100 sites with the NEVI funds in Louisiana based on that $73 million kind of apportionment. But that should cover a lot of our interstate and give us quite a bit of room to play around with. So it's very exciting times there. Next slide, please. So in terms of how Louisiana is going to use our funds, that is still in development. So Louisiana Clean Fuels as a coalition have won a contract with the Department of Transportation to help them develop their state plan, which is a requirement under the NEVI program. So we have to have a Louisiana state electric vehicle plan that basically describes how Louisiana intends to support electric vehicle development over or across our state. And that plan is due for submittal to the FHWA on August 1st. We do have a draft that is available for public comment already that is published, that was published on June 21st, and it is on the DOTD website there on the page, and just put that in the chat, which is great. So you can go there, read through our draft plan. There's a lot that needs to be changed, but you can submit any comments that you have about how we should use those funds, what we should do with it, where the priorities lie, and kind of get your voice heard on that. And we really, really do want that formal comment so that we can develop a really robust plan in Louisiana. And then every year through the 5-year program, that plan will be updated as we learn more, as we get more public feedback, as the grant program actually goes out and we see how it's being taken advantage of, and what's working, what's not working. It needs to be kind of a living document to make sure that we're using it as well as possible. And then after that August 1st deadline that it is submitted, we will get nomination, or we'll get approved or denied by the FHWA by September 30th, which is very, very quick. And once that's done, Louisiana can start developing our grant program. We don't know exactly when applications are going to open for that grant program, but we're anticipating sometime in Q1 or Q2 of 2023 being able to open up the funds for application and hopefully get some of these dollars on the road. And then I'll also mention too that we're going to have an interactive website that will allow you to kind of drop pins on a map and say where you either want a charging site to exist and where you feel the need for charging sites to exist. Or if you are a potential site host and you are interested in hosting a site, you can express your interest on the map as well. And that should be live, I think, by the end of the week, maybe next week. And that'll be navigable through the DOTD website as well. So all that is there, and it'd be a great resource. We also have the driveelectric.gov, the main website for the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation's program under NEVI. And that exists. It's got a bunch of really, really great resources and tools that you can use, and you can learn more about the program at large there. So next slide, please, Anne. And then we got our kind of last little bit of news regarding NEVI is that the minimum standards have been published, or the proposed minimum standards for the NEVI funding. So basically the FHWA submitted these proposed minimum standards that will say how you can actually spend this funding, what sites are going to require in terms of their technical specs, their cybersecurity measures, kind of everything to do with how the money is going to be spent. And that is like an 82-page document that is really great, really, really in-depth, and proposes a lot of different standards for how these chargers are going to have to be maintained, how we're going to measure all the metrics and all that sort of stuff and learn about it. If you have any interest in submitting a formal comment on that, especially if you are a potential site host and want your voice heard, that is open for comment until August 22nd of this year. And the page, I think Anne linked it down in the chat, but it is also here at the govinfo.gov. Govinfo.gov is a great website name. It's the first time I've read that one out loud. But anyway, that is all readable there, and it's great. And if you want 82 pages of technical specs, you can read through that and submit your comments. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the EPA Clean School Bus Rebate Program. So this one's going to be of particular relevance to Louisiana. They are focusing on rural and underserved communities, of which we have plenty in Louisiana. So this is great funding for replacing buses. And I think everybody should be pretty familiar with replacing school buses through a program like this, through the Volkswagen settlement, which is closed in Louisiana, but we did focus on school buses. So many of you are probably very familiar with this sort of funding and chasing these dollars. So let's talk a little bit about what is included and what is allowable. So I mentioned that it's $5 billion for electric school buses across the country. Now, this isn't being apportioned to state DOTs or anything like that, like the NEVI funds are, nor is it going to be distributed like the Volkswagen funds were. So Louisiana does not have a dedicated pot of money for this. So this means it's going to be competitive. Well, we'll talk about how that's going to go in a second. $2.5 billion, as I mentioned, is dedicated to zero emission buses, electric and hydrogen, and $2.5 billion dedicated to clean school buses, which is any alternative fuel that shows any emissions reductions. So that's propane, natural gas, electric, hydrogen. Biofuels are specifically not included, at least not like biodiesel. And they call out the reason being that there's no way to guarantee that those engines will be used for that with that fuel. So that's one specific call out that was in the guidance and in the program. The funding will be available over 5 years, $1 billion, or approximately up to $1 billion per year, although this first year is only $500 million approximately. And the EPA may provide up to 100% of the cost of the bus and its fueling infrastructure. We'll talk more about how this is going to break down in a second, but that's a really big deal that it can fund up to 100% of project cost. And then rural and low income areas are a priority. There is a whole list of priority criteria. If you meet a single one of them, you are put in the priority list. But the main one I think will be relevant in Louisiana is this rural and low income areas requirement or criteria. And there is a link there to a full list of all parishes or all counties, if you're out of Louisiana, that are in prioritized districts, and many of the Louisiana ones already are. So you can look there if you are in any doubt and find your parish, see if you're a priority. Go on, please. So I mentioned that funds can go up to 100% of the project costs. There is a specific breakdown on that here on this chart. Don't expect you to read through all of this, but the kind of high level items is that there is a cap on funding for each vehicle type. It is based on the class of the bus and the fuel type. So if it's an electric bus of class 7 plus, it'll be $375,000 or less that it can fund. And then if it's natural gas or propane, it's a little bit lower. And that's kind of chasing what the marginal cost is, the difference between a diesel bus and a propane or CNG bus. And those amounts seem like they're pretty close to what that marginal cost is. So it'll be about the same cost as a diesel bus for those particular fuel types. And then it's also split up by the prioritization criteria that I mentioned just a second ago. If you're in the top prioritization criteria, you get that top row of funding for the bus, and then it's less for non-prioritized school districts. And then the interesting thing here too that's new with this program versus something like DERA is that it can also fund infrastructure. So charging infrastructure can get up to $20,000 for a prioritized district or $13,000 for another eligible district that is not prioritized. So that will cover a decent bit of the cost of a charger depending on what type of charger you go with and kind of all those sorts of things. But that is something you really want to be talking to your utility about or potential providers if you want to get a full breakdown of that sort of thing, or talk to us. We're happy to give any guidance that we can with this. And then the first year of the program is open for applications. Many of you probably know this from our email blasts or on our website, but the deadline for applications in this first round is August 19th, which is kind of right around the corner. That is kind of tomorrow. It's also a lot longer than I expected the period to be, which is very, very good news. But you have until August 19th to apply. And this is one of those reasons that, again, I mentioned earlier, you should really endeavor to have project ideas before grant programs exist so that you're ready for this thing and you're ready to kind of jump at any opportunity that comes around. Because even prepared potential applicants may have a longer time or may take longer to develop the application than you expect. Next slide, please. So in this first round of funding, the program is going to be a rebate program, which is very, very similar to the Diesel Emissions Reductions Act program, if you're familiar with DERA at all. And this means that you're going to have to destroy the old bus that you're replacing, unless you have no buses newer than, or older rather, than 2011 model year. If you don't have any eligible buses for destruction, you can sell the bus. That's all kind of laid out on our website, but also in the actual program itself if you happen to not have any older buses, which is very unlikely. But you do have to destroy the old bus, prove that you've destroyed it, and then replace it with the bus that is being funded under the program. And we don't know what the future rounds are going to look like. They specifically said that they were going to try to model the first round off of DERA because A, it's a program that the EPA knows very well and has been very successful for them, but also to try to get this funding out sooner rather than later so that we can get these older, dirtier buses off the road as quickly as possible and improve the air quality for our kids. It's very, very important. So they want to roll this out fast. And then there's also DERA funding available every single year, and you can use that for alternative fuel buses. I know that East Baton Rouge Parish School Board has taken advantage of this many, many, many times, and I think will continue to do so. But that funding is available, and there is a link there on the page. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Next slide, please. And I do want to that was the end of my grant portion of this. I do want to specifically call out the fact that on our YouTube channel, we do post all of these webinars, and we did a webinar on grant readiness that was held in March. We did it in partnership with Clean Fuels Ohio and East Tennessee Clean Cities Coalition, or East Tennessee Clean Fuels, two great clean cities coalitions we work with quite often, as well as the Center for Sustainable Energy. We chatted a little bit about a lot of grant preparedness, getting ready in advance of funding coming out. But then also actually going through and managing grant programs once you're awarded and kind of executing on projects. And then next slide, please. And then the other sessions that we have today before we get to the Q&A are a clean transportation solutions for ports discussion, which would be next after this at 12:30 Central. We're going to be discussing a lot of cool stuff that ports can kind of be doing for clean transportation and reducing emissions and reducing costs. The next slide. Next slide, please. Oh,
Technical
So,
difficulties, hold on,
it wouldn't be a Zoom thing if there weren't technical difficulties.
we're back.
There we are. And then probably the most important session I think that we'll be doing this entire summit is building a resilient transportation system. This is incredibly important, especially in Louisiana, where we get hurricanes, it seems daily these days. We really need to make sure that whenever we're rolling these vehicles out, we are not harming resiliency or making it harder for people to evacuate or for first responders to get to where they need to go. So very, very important session that we'll be doing later on today at 3 p.m. with a really, really great session or selection of panelists. So please do tune in for that. And then next slide. And then I can't not mention that we do have a Clean Fuel Summit in 2023 that will be in person this time around next year, which we're really excited about. We do have the dates for that already, April 18th through 20th. And then we have our next Clean Fuel Classic golf tournament, which is just a fun, great time to network on April 10th, 2023 at University Club. So you can save the date for that. And then we have time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please do put it in the Q&A box below. And we do have a couple of things that I wanted to discuss with Callie in absence, not absence, of specific questions that y'all have for us in the box below. So I think that the kind of first question, we've talked a little bit about match earlier, Callie, and one thing I'd like to understand better, and maybe the audience would like to understand better, is can funding be stacked? Can you use programs as match for other programs? How does that sort of thing work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will just head off everything by saying each program is different. In short, yes, you can stack funding. The general rule of thumb is that you can't stack funding sources from the same agencies or same pots of funding. So if you are getting federal funding for a specific program, you're probably not going to be able to go through a different federal program for that same project. Now, certain things like, VW was not really friendly to stacking at all. But one avenue for that is utility funding. So federal programs, state programs can be stacked with utility funding for infrastructure for electric projects. So that is one avenue. Yeah, it really just depends on the program. In short, yes, there are opportunities for stacking.
And I think one thing too that we've had some discussions with different program managers and that sort of stuff in the past is that sometimes the definition of project is really important when it comes to matching funds. If the project is broader than simply replacing one vehicle, then other portions of funding that have been brought into a overall project can kind of broaden the scope a little bit, and you can include more things in the matching funds, kind of depending on the program. But having that definition of what the project itself is, I think sometimes crucial for hitting that matching contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. Like you said, maybe you're not going to be able to stack two different sources for the vehicles, but what about the infrastructure? What about the make ready, getting the actual fuel to the site? There's a lot of opportunities and a lot of different ways that you can angles from which you can approach a project. So kind of fitting those puzzle pieces together is definitely one of the strategies we use.
Yeah, and then to the fitting puzzle pieces together thing, I think to talk a little bit about the kind of commitment letters is often a requirement in some of these programs, and I know that's been a hurdle for us at times for projects. And just to kind of peel that curtain back a little bit, commitment letters are not always completely binding. The person who's on the hook when it comes to programs like this and applications is the actual applicant themselves, not the people who sign the commitment letters or like third parties. It's really just that applicant who's going to be on the hook for any failing of the project. So if you are trying to partner on a program and somebody asks you for a commitment letter, take that into account and obviously pass it by legal and all that sort of stuff to get everything really fleshed out. But know that you're not going to be penalized necessarily if you don't provide on your end and have to back out for some reason. It's going to be on the applicant side of things. They're the ones who bear the brunt of that requirement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, to your point, the contract is usually just between the funding agency and the applicant. So commitment letters are really important to provide that context to the agency, like, hey, this project applicant is talking to relevant stakeholders and engaging the community, engaging other, whether it's, they have a commitment from their construction engineering firm, they're ready to go. That's really what those commitment letters are demonstrating.
Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about being kind of prepared for things before they come out, being just really ready with a lot of different grant ideas. I'll just brag very slightly for Louisiana Clean Fuels. If you were in our general session yesterday, you would have heard Anne talk a lot about the different grants that we're part of now. I think we got like 3 or 4 different grant programs going on that we were all partnered on or were leads on. And that really did come out from us being very prepared early on before any of the opportunities came around, and then jumping at the chance once they came around. And we already had the partners planned out. We had those, not necessarily the commitment letters, but kind of the people we're interested in working with. We were already discussing stuff with them and saying, hey, if funds come out for this type of project, let's really get on it and be ready. And we do kind of keep just a bank of ideas in our back pocket. I think Anne and I probably have too many ideas, but we do have several different plans for if any grant comes out, funding that fits in with a particular project or particular need that we see, we can jump at it. And I think you talked about that earlier a little bit about really knowing what the needs and what the desires of a grant program are and what the specific ask is for. What is the intent of a grant program, and matching that as closely as possible will make your application much more attractive, because you're actually you're meeting the needs of that specific pot of funding, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think just going back to that project readiness, if there is anything that I can have people take away from today, it would just be the timing piece and being prepared. If you have a project that you want to start today, the timing for looking for the opportunity to look for funding for that was probably about 6 months ago. Because there is a lead time, if you have a project, maybe the funding program isn't open right then you have to go through the application process. On the back end of that, there's a couple of months for the agency to make a decision and a selection. After that, we have contract execution, making sure all the legal requirements are met, doing any back and forth with contracting with the agency, and then you get to the actual deployment period. So that can be a lead time of, several months up to a year. In some places we've seen when things have kind of been delayed, especially in the past couple of years. So really just stressing the preparation with timing. One good thing to note, these federal programs, a lot of the programs we talked about today, are a little bit more generous on the back end about when you have to actually deploy the vehicle. So some projects have a shorter time period. If you submit an application now, you get approved, you have to get this project completed within 12 months. A lot of the federal programs are more generous with that. We can see anything from 2 to 5 years of a deployment timeline. So there is some flexibility there, but we just really stress on the front end, having those projects in mind. And there's nothing to say that if you have a project in mind, you're not seeing publicly published funds, or you're having a hard time understanding what's out there, reach out to people like your Clean Cities Coalition, who can help kind of guide you and match you up and let you know what maybe is not available now, but is coming down the pipeline.
So speaking of stuff coming down the pipeline, there's a lot of focus on electrification these days, but what are some other opportunities that are coming around that are not purely for electrification? I know we talked a little bit about that with the Clean School Bus program, having some allowance for propane and CNG, but are there other programs that people should be paying attention to that are not just electrification, so they can have a really nice, broad, diverse transportation marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we definitely spent some time talking about NEVI today, but that is not to say that there isn't funding for all fuel types across the board. So like you were mentioning, Tyler, this Clean School Bus program, please don't think that that is just for battery electric. There is funding for all types of school buses in that program. The Low-No program for transit buses that funds multiple fuel types. We have the, those federal competitive grants for fueling infrastructure for corridors and communities. That's also through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We have the hydrogen hubs program. That's a funding through the federal infrastructure bill. That's going to be for really transformative hydrogen projects regionally across the United States, but there's just going to be an enormous investment in hydrogen infrastructure, which will benefit that entire fuel market. And then we have, like I mentioned before, we're talking about some of the new programs. There's a lot of standard programs that have been around for a while that will continue to be funded, that have fueling, not fueling, funding for fuel agnostic projects. So the clean diesel program, both on the national and the state level, EPA targeted airshed, which targets ozone non-attainment regions. There's a lot of dollars out there for a variety of project types. So, definitely encourage you to not, or folks to not just think of this as an electric space.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a couple too that we're pretty familiar with here in Louisiana, the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration's low or no emission program. I know that a couple of our transit agencies in Louisiana have taken advantage of that. There's even more influx of dollars into that, like I mentioned earlier, through the infrastructure law. There's the Diesel Emissions Reductions Act we talked about earlier, the congestion mitigation and air quality, CMAQ funds. Yeah, there's a lot out there. And if you're interested in any programs like that and want to get in with that, GNA or Clean Cities are your people to talk to. So definitely reach out. And in terms of resources, what resources would y'all suggest from y'all's perspective for determining which technologies, vehicles, equipment are available on the market, especially like available today for any of these programs?
Yeah, really key part of it, right? You can't get funding for something if you don't know what you want funding for. So, I mentioned at the start of my slides, from a just overall technology matching perspective, a resource like that State of Sustainable Fleets report is good for just understanding, okay, which fuel works for my operations. That is a great resource for the actual equipment and vehicles available themselves. The Alternative Fuels Data Center, Tyler, you touched on that as a resource. They have a great page on lists of just current manufacturers and models of vehicles available across different weight classes and different vocations. That is a great place to look. Obviously, GNA has a lot of our own resources as well. But yeah, I would recommend AFDC definitely from what vehicles are on the market perspective, and State of Sustainable Fleets for the more overall what technology meets my needs.
And then I'll also put in a plug for ACT Expo. Going to the Advanced Clean Transportation Expo in California every year is fantastic. There are over 100 vehicles on the showroom floor. You can actually go look and maybe even drive some of them. So that's a fantastic place to see them in person. And another thing I'll just kind of plug too with talking about figuring out which technologies are available. One of the things that I like to do as a Clean Cities coordinator and project manager is really getting these fleets to talk to each other. If you're looking at trying to do a particular project or trying to deploy propane buses in your school fleet, for example, the first thing that I would do is put you in contact with the East Baton Rouge Parish School Board, because they've been operating propane in their fleet for a long time and it's been really successful. In getting that conversation going between people of different projects who might have kind of aligned goals or have experience that they can share, getting that experience out there and really sharing it, and knowledge sharing is incredibly important. And it's a great way to see those technologies in person, get firsthand experience with them, and not kind of have to rely on just seeing pictures online and hope that it works. So that's one of the things that we really want to do as much as we can. Anne did put in the chat for everybody that there's a notice of intent right now for funding before the funding announcement actually comes out. And you can follow that you can actually just kind of Google that number and it'll come up. But that is a thing that you can be prepared for now, and reading about and understanding what the focuses of that particular program will be, so that you can kind of prepare your projects and be as well prepared for these as possible, as we've talked about a lot today in this particular webinar. Callie, is there anything else that you'd like to kind of focus on before we adjourn for the day? I know we're a little bit ahead of time, which is miraculous.
No, I think this was, informative for me as well. Key takeaways, just timing, preparation, and making sure that you're going after projects that you want to go after, not just trying to fit them into a project or a program because it exists. And I would just say, we did do a high level overview today. I'm always happy to talk to folks if you have any questions about what we talked about today, or just general market funding questions. I think the slides will be distributed. My contact information is there. So just happy to reach out and continue the conversation.
Yeah, I just to echo stuff that you said, being in contact with GNA is incredibly valuable. Joe and Audie with GNA does serve on our board now at Louisiana Clean Fuels, and they are members of ours, which we're really excited about, and we really appreciate that support. There's a lot that can be done whenever you're working together on these sorts of things, and being prepared in advance and having these communication channels kind of really open early and often is very, very important. And yeah, the slides will be sent out to everybody. They'll be available on our website, and we will have a recording posted on our YouTube channel. And with that, I think we can call it a day. Hopefully I'll see y'all back in about an hour whenever our next session begins. Thank you so much, Callie, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you.